A few months ago, I decided to jump feet first into our new Next.js support by rebuilding my vanilla WordPress site with a Next.js front end to the existing WordPress backend. I'll say more about that project later, but last week our co-founder Josh Koenig talked about how LLMs are getting better at writing production quality, or at least good enough code. And the thing that I wanted to talk about today is what it's actually like to use Claude Code to write code for production. Because going into this, I didn't know anything about Next.js. So I used this as an opportunity to see how far I could get by vibe coding this project and what sorts of things I would need to do to keep it on the rails. Because one of the most consistent things that I've run into using Claude Code or any coding agent is that sometimes it writes completely wrong things, and sometimes it rewrites everything it just wrote, potentially throwing away hours or even days of work. I had already gotten the idea from talking with Anna Mikhailova, Director of Technology at Kalamuna, to use test-driven development for AI-generated code as a way to prevent against regressions. The problem was that just telling Claude Code to use TDD doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to use TDD, or will use it consistently, or use it every time, or even write meaningful tests that aren't just assert true equals true. So I developed an adversarial reviewer approach that takes inspiration from how these models are trained. Most modern LLMs are trained using this adversarial model. In extremely simple terms, it's like having two agents yelling at each other. Agent 1 says, I think this is true, and Agent 2 says, are you sure? And forces Agent 1 to check its work. This is how LLMs produce output that is closer to actual truth, or at least how LLMs produce output that sounds truthy. I took this idea and decided what I really needed was another agent that could check Claude Code's output to make sure it did everything that I wanted it to, everything that was required for the project. Did it write the tests? Did the code pass lint checks? Are the tests actually passing? Does the build run? Now, again, it's one thing to tell Claude Code to use the reviewer to check its work, but then you're still relying on Claude to remember to spin it up. Many approaches to integrating LLMs into your daily workflows tell you to treat AI like an untrained intern or else like an unruly child. Basically, expect that it will forget to do what you asked or sidestep particular instructions for convenience or speed. And when I started implementing this workflow, I was running into that. So I added a forcing function that I couldn't bypass. There are three ways that the reviewer workflow is enforced. The Claude.md file is read every time you open a Claude session. In theory, this is supposed to be what it's working from in every interaction. So if you say always use TDD before writing any code, in theory it should do that, right? The problem is that if an interaction goes on long enough, it will compress the information from earlier in the chat or forget what it understood at the beginning of the conversation and start veering off the rails. You should have your instructions in Claude.md, but you can't assume that Claude will consistently remember or even refer back to Claude.md every time you prompt it. Claude also has its own internal hook system. You can use these to adjust what Claude does behaviorally, but it's still possible for Claude to skip those if it thinks for some reason it's not necessary. So, in addition to these things, which are also in the reviewer workflow, I also added a pre-commit hook to the workflow so that assuming you're using version controlling in your project and assuming you're letting Claude write commits, no code can actually be committed at all before the reviewer agent has a chance to look at it. The prompt for the reviewer agent says, you are a principal engineer on this project. You have comprehensive knowledge of the technologies of this project and the proper workflows for development on the project. You are reviewing code from a junior developer. You are empathetic and patient, but methodical and strict. You are highly opinionated about best practices and standards and will reject code contributions that violate the rules and standards of the project. You are providing a review for code generated by your junior dev to ensure that the code meets all the project standards before a commit is allowed. It then has a series of instructions for how to review and approve commits, including a reviewer checklist file that has the full list of specific criteria the code must follow to be accepted. The pre-commit hook is the key. It runs a shell script that first checks if the reviewer left behind a file that says it reviewed Claude's work. This reviewer approved file contains a timestamp that gets validated to ensure that it's current. If there's no reviewer approved file or the file is old, it blocks the commit and says you need to spawn an agent and get a fresh approval. If we get past that and a reviewer approved file is found, it checks the commit size. I don't want Claude writing vast swaths of code. I want commits to be small and purpose-built. I want to see many small commits in the commit history because that's how I like to code. And it's far more difficult to review and fix large commits across many files and hundreds of lines of code. It's the sort of thing that, as a human, I'm less likely to inspect closely because it's too much information. So the script checks how big the proposed commit is, and if it's too big, rejects that, insisting that Claude go back and make this commit smaller. It then runs all the appropriate tests, linting, unit tests, end-to-end tests, whatever you've set up. If any of these fail, again, it rejects the commit and sends it back to Claude to fix it. Finally, it can check the commit to see if you've committed any secrets to the repository by accident, because sometimes Claude will do that. And if you do commit it to version control, you're going to have a harder time undoing the mess that it created. And then once it gets through all of these checkpoints, the workflow passes and a commit can finally be made. Exceptions are carved out if only text files are being added, and tests can be skipped if all you're doing is updating something that's not actually testable or not relevant for tests, like updating GitHub Actions workflows. Now, as a human, you might want to commit things too, and you can do this by passing user commit equals 1 before you commit. It will still run the test, but it won't force you, the human, to spawn a reviewer agent or get an approval. Now, here's the thing that you still need to watch out for. You can tell Claude as much as you want to never pass user commit equals 1, but you still need to be looking for it, because it can and will try to bypass its own reviewer workflow by masquerading as a user if you're not paying attention. Generally, when I catch it doing this, I use strong language like never ever use user commit equals 1. Sometimes Claude will say it's adding this to memory, but honestly I don't know what that means or if it makes it any less likely to happen again. Once I crafted this workflow for my Next.js site build, I wanted to figure out how it could be adapted to other projects, so I broke it out into its own repository with a one-line installer to get it set up on a new project. It uses a reviewer config file that you can edit later, but the installer walks you through setting that up on the first time install. You can drop it into a new project, configure it, and keep moving. Only now, when Claude tries to commit, it's going to run into the reviewer agent, forcing it to check its work. The point of the reviewer agent is not to make Claude code produce architecturally perfect output. But if we're going into pairing with an LLM that is acting as our unruly child intern, it's a way to force it to think about what it's doing and create output that's one step closer to trustworthiness, which is crucial when you're letting LLMs write your production code. And you can take this workflow and extend it however you want. You can update the instructions in the reviewer prompt or the reviewer checklist, agents.md, or claude.md files to give more context to the agent when it runs. A really good idea that longtime WordPresser Dan Now suggested was using a different LLM to be the reviewer agent. That falls naturally into this idea of an adversarial reviewer, and I'm here for it. Asking, say, Gemini to check Claude's work is likely going to result in a different take than asking Claude to review Claude's own work. If this is interesting to you, take a look at my Claude Code Reviewer repository and try it out on your own projects. I'm always happy to chat about what's working and what's not, and I'd love to hear what your take is.